Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Common Dreams has a piece entitled "No One Is Spared." South Africa presents genocide case against Israel at ICJ. Quote, Israel's political leaders, military commanders, and persons holding official positions have systematically and in explicit terms declared their genocidal intent. This was from one of the South African lawyers at the UN court. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled I Dare Say, A Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, and let me also say, not only are you a brilliant historian, but you're also an attorney, which is one of the reasons why we are so looking forward to your analysis here. South African representatives argued before the ICJ today that Israel is engaged in a genocidal assault on the Gaza Strip, subjecting the enclave to merciless bombing with the clear intent to wipe out the Palestinian population. Now that this case is being presented to the ICJ, your thoughts on what was presented today, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, this is a profoundly significant historical development of world historic proportion. Number one, you saw graphically in the courtroom in The Hague the fact that the baton in the Pan-African world has been passed officially from Black Americans to South Africa. Recall that during the era of colonialism, during the era of rampaging imperialism, there was this Pan-Africanist movement that W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, helped to ignite. But that movement tended to wither as Africa and the Caribbean came to independence. And now we see this monumental significance of South Africa, this ANC government sending the best and the brightest of its jurists to The Hague, no less. And I say The Hague because we also remember that it was in 1652 that the Dutch, many of them with roots in The Hague, were dispatched to the southern tip of Africa to colonize that part of Africa, and then their descendants in 1948 imposing apartheid, that inhumane, horrific system, that it took a significant struggle spearheaded by Nelson Mandela to overturn by 1994, which then brings us to Nelson Mandela himself. It's no accident that a statue in his honor had been erected on the west bank of the Jordan River, because we know that Mr. Mandela was famous for saying that South Africa's independence would mean little unless and until Palestine was free. And so we see that once again, Mr. Mandela's words have been vindicated, because we also know that during the battle days of apartheid, that Israel was collaborating with the apartheid authorities, despite the fact that the apartheid authorities were violently anti-Jewish, despite the fact that Israel supposedly was going to uplift Jewish people all over the world, and they decided not to do so when they turned their backs on the persecuted Jewish community of South Africa. But alas, what that meant was that many of the persecuted Jewish community of South Africa then aligned with Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. I'm speaking of Joe Slovo, Lithuanian Jewish descent, who became the leader of the armed wing of the ANC. Bruce First, killed by a letter bomb while in exile in Mozambique. She, of course, was the spouse of Slovo, a very scintillating propagandist on behalf of the anti-apartheid movement. I'm speaking of Ronnie Caswell, still in the land of the living, who also played a key role in the armed struggle against apartheid, he too being of Jewish descent. And so we see that there was a confluence of many profound and significant historical trend in the courtroom in The Hague today. We have witnessed history. And it's also noteworthy to point out that, as the New York Times suggested in a waspish fashion this morning, this case will probably be a winning case for the ANC's electoral chances during the elections of 2024. That is to say that the ANC was engaging not only in a humane gesture, but smart politics in bringing this case to the International Court of Justice. Now, we also know that the South African lawyers are seeking an injunction. They're seeking the equivalent of an injunction, a cease and desist order, the equivalent of what we have been demanding on this side of the Atlantic, a ceasefire. Now, we also know that ultimately it will take weeks, if not months, some say years, for there to be a fuller investigation of what the Israeli authorities have been perpetrating on the West Bank. But we know, in Gaza and also on the West Bank to a degree, but we know thus far from their presentation that it was a devastating case that they presented. I'm speaking of what was called reproductive violence perpetrated by the Israeli authorities intending to prevent the birth of Palestinian children. I'm thinking of the hunger, the starvation that's now stalking Gaza. In fact, despite the fact that there are only a few million Palestinians in Gaza, according to United Nations authorities, about 80% of the world's worst cases of starvation today are taking place in that strip of land that's hardly bigger than the island of Manhattan. I'm speaking of the contaminated water that is a direct result of Israeli depredation. I'm thinking of the disease. I'm thinking of the destroying of hospitals. I'm thinking of the displacement with all of this loose talk coming from Israeli cabinet members about dispatching Palestinians into the Sinai Desert. Even loose talk about sending them all the way to the Congo, believe it or not. And so this was a devastating case that was brought on behalf of the suffering Palestinians, and we have to take our hats off to the African National Congress government for placing so much pressure on the Israeli authorities, because now the scuttlebutt coming out of Israel proper is the Netanyahu government may not be able to survive for much longer, that in the midst of a bloody war, the Netanyahu government may be compelled and forced to call elections, because in terms of their objectives, that is to say, destroying Hamas, don't check that box, rescuing the so-called detainees, Israeli detainees, don't check that box, and de-radicalizing the West Bank and Gaza, certainly do not check that box. And so Mr. Netanyahu's popularity rating is plummeting precipitously, and going along with the maniac madness of the so-called Jewish power members of his coalition, I'm speaking of Gavir and Smotrich, that has brought Israel to the brink of disaster. And here's a tip to some in your audience. I've been monitoring Israeli media, particularly the program that you can find online of the Israeli commentator Caroline Glick. And what's interesting about Caroline Glick, and also of many of the other ultra-rightists in Israel, so they all speak with these U.S. accents, which is not surprising, because in many ways, and I'm speaking of Mr. Netanyahu too, to a certain degree, who spent a good deal of his youth in New England and in Western Pennsylvania, that is to say that Israel is sort of a clone of 19th century North American settler colonialism on steroids. However, they have not realized that times have changed since the 19th century. They no longer can perpetrate genocide the way that their ancestors in North America did in the 19th century. And that also reflects another point that needs to be highlighted. The fact that a leading member of the global South, speaking of South Africa, to drag Israel into the dock, forcing Israel to send to The Hague one of their leading jurists, Aharon Barak, who is 87 years old, a Holocaust descendant, in fact, a mentor to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan. This reflects the fact that South Africa forced Israel to bring in its big guns, pardon the expression, to defend itself, because South Africa being able to do that is a direct reflection of the changed global correlation of forces, the fact that U.S. imperialism no longer can call all the shots. In fact, U.S. imperialism is being damaged severely by aiding and abetting this genocide. And indeed, this case might lead to further charges against the aiders and abettors in Washington, D.C. They need to be careful. And this is a reflection of a new world order that is totally unlike what was enunciated 3 decades ago by then U.S. President George H.W. Bush. And so we should also take heed of what South Africa is doing. That is to say, if our Black leadership had the moxie and the gumption of the ANC leadership, they would bring their own genocide case against the United States the way Paul Robeson sought to do in 1950, because we still suffer from spiraling and escalating rates of infant mortality, police terror, executions in gas chambers and electric chairs. However, I'm afraid to say that it may be South Africa that has to bring the case on behalf of Black Americans to the International Court of Justice, rather than this sorry excuse for leadership we have in Black America today.
Dr. Horne, one more article. Israeli lawmakers reaffirm genocidal rhetoric on the eve of the ICJ trial. So even as all this is going on, they're sending their lawyer, and their guys back home are like, yeah, what are you talking about? We're not committing genocide. That's just what we do. As the Iranians say, thank God for making my enemies fool. Your thoughts on this? We only got about 2 to 3 minutes, Professor Horne.
Well, I think that what that bespeaks is the arrogance infused by ignorance of the Israeli authorities. It also represents something else, I'm afraid to say. Recall that some years ago, President Putin of Russia suggested that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He has been derided in this country and in the North Atlantic world. But if you begin to explore that statement and begin to explore the point that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had also the retreat of many working class movements and many labor unions, particularly in the United States. And you see Israel, which started off, believe it or not, although this is hard to recall, as a kind of social democratic experiment. That was the import of the so-called kibbutz in the desert, as it was called then. But alas, with the retreat of the organized left and their compadres in the trade union movement, you've seen the rise of nationalism. And you not only see that within Israel with the rise of the so-called Jewish power movement, you see it in Italy, where once you had the strongest communist party in the North Atlantic community, now ruled by neo-fascists. You see it in the United States of America, once again with the decline of Robeson and Du Bois and our internationalist leadership, and now leaders who do not think at all in an international fashion. And of course, you see it in Israel once again. And I think it's rather ironic, is it not, that those who say that they are the descendants of the Holocaust are now seeking to perpetrate a genocide in historic Palestine. But alas, this is not unique to the Israelis. We also recall that in Ireland, they oftentimes talk about being the first colonized people at the hands of the English hundreds of years ago. And yet the Irish Americans perpetrated the genocide against Native Americans in North America. They perpetrated pogroms against Black Americans in New York City in 1863 during the draft riots. They were the tip of the spear when the indigenous of Australia were routed beginning in the latter part of the 18th century. And so, once again, the Israelis need to realize that times have changed that this is not the late 18th century, this is not the 19th century, and that the international community is coming for them, and they better change sooner rather than later.
Quick question as we get out. You mentioned a little earlier that this was also a brilliant political strategy by the ANC. The converse of that, I believe, is that this is also a incredibly bad political move by the Biden administration. And one example here is stop vetoing peace. Rabbis tell Biden at UN Security Council protest, we are here as Jews, as rabbis, to urge the UN to follow through. These are rabbis for ceasefire. And so you've got a number of American Jewish groups that are protesting in favor of the Palestinians. They are contradicting the standard narrative that anti-Semitism equates to, I'm sorry, that anti-Zionism equates to anti-Semitism. And it seems as though Joe Biden is doing everything he can to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, or snatch victory from however that one would go. Dr. Horne.
Well, I would like to believe what some of the commentators have been suggesting. That is to say that the U.S. administration is looking for an off-ramp. They are welcoming this pressure on Israel. I find that hard to believe in light of the fact that White House spokesman John Kirby has denounced this ICJ petition by the South Africans. He has been echoed by Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who has said likewise. But perhaps I would like to think that there is an iota or a scintilla of truth in that analysis. In any case, what's going to happen is that international momentum is growing so ferociously that even if the Biden administration does not welcome this ICJ case by the South Africans, like the Israeli authorities themselves, they may have no choice but to accept its import and accept this cease and desist order that I am confident will be coming from the ICJ. Recall that the ICJ also includes lawyers from Russia and China and Brazil and Lebanon, amongst others. They only need 8 votes out of 15. I am confident that those 8 votes will be garnered, and I am also confident that Palestine will be free, and to coin a phrase, from the river to the sea.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for that analysis. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you.